Tonight, the United Nations warns its operation in Gaza is on the verge of collapse, as Israel says Hamas is holding 199 hostages. Aid is still not getting into Gaza as food and water supplies dwindle, and the US warns an Israeli occupation will be a big mistake. Back here in Westminster, MPs return from their conference break. The Prime Minister confirms 6 British people have died and 10 are missing since Hamas's attack 10 days ago. The Conservative MP, Sir Peter Bone, is facing a 6-week suspension for bullying and indecent exposure, which could lead to yet another by-election headache for the Prime Minister. And as 2 political foes embrace, we'll look back at the other times when rivalries have been set aside. All that and more with Luke Tryl and Alicia Kearns, who are here to give their take for the next hour. It's Monday, I'm Sophy Ridge, we're live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Right now, it feels like we're waiting to see if Israel launches a ground invasion in Gaza, waiting to see what happens on the border with Lebanon, how far and deep this conflict will spread across the Middle East. Waiting and hoping to see if a safe corridor is opened with Egypt to get aid into Gaza and to get people out. Waiting and bracing ourselves for more people to die. And the thought of more people dying right now is pretty hard to take because there's been so much death that's already happened. Little children murdered, young people running for their lives at a peace festival, airstrikes, blowing up houses, hospitals. And if you're anything like me, when there is this much death, the temptation is to look away. But the world will bear witness to what is happening in the Middle East now. So on the programme today, we'll bring you the very latest from the Israel-Hamas war, and we'll be looking at the political reaction here in the United Kingdom. Thank you for watching and for not looking away. Sky's Thomas Moore reports on the events of today so far.
At the border between Gaza and Egypt, people are massing in their hundreds, if not thousands, clutching whatever they could carry. Families desperate to flee the bombs and a worsening humanitarian crisis, hoping the gate to safety will open sometime soon. Under a deal brokered by the United States, those with foreign passports should be allowed to cross, but Egyptian authorities are unwilling to open up without assurances from Israel that it's safe to do so.
To be honest with you, today is horrible. We went to the Rafah crossing and we imagined that there's a ceasefire, and it turned out to be nothing. Actually, the missiles were fired on our heads on the way there, and we found hundreds of people are staying just waiting for the crossing to open.
The city of Kearns has seen its population double as people flee the evacuation zone in the north of Gaza. There's not enough food or water, and hospitals have been overwhelmed with casualties. The Palestinian Prime Minister called for the bombings to cease.
We are people of a civilization. We are not animals like they are painting us, and our people will not surrender. And we are appealing to the Prime Minister of Israel to stop aggression.
New body cam video has emerged from a Hamas militant who crossed into Israel on October the 7th. They attack a residential complex, heavily armed, moving from building to building, hunting down the people who lived there. Israel now says 199 hostages are being held in Gaza. Hadass fears her mum, children and ex-husband are among them.
I could hear them. They come in the house. They broke, they smashed, it was a massacre, yeah? It was really like Holocaust.
Meanwhile, the diplomacy continues. After a whirlwind tour of the Middle East, the US Secretary of State touched down in Tel Aviv for the second time in a week with a clear message for its ally.
You know our deep commitment to Israel's right, indeed its obligation, to defend itself and to defend its people. And in that, you have and will always have the support of the United States.
Israeli forces continue to build on the border with Gaza. The defence minister says it will be a long war and the price will be high. Thomas Moore, Sky News.
Well, it was the first day back for MPs today after a 3-week recess for party conferences. And within that 3 weeks, I think it's no exaggeration to say the world has transformed. Thousands dead, hundreds taken hostage, and a war in the Middle East with no end in sight. The events have appalled MPs on all sides of the House. And while the issue bitterly divides society, I mean, you only have to look at social media to see that, the political response has been marked by consistency, with the Conservative and Labour leadership both offering support for Israel. Well, today MPs debated the war and the next steps for the UK response. Sky's Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates reports.
A Prime Minister showing the Jewish community and the country who he's standing with.
I'm very pleased to welcome the Prime Minister.
Visiting a Jewish school in North London, a show of solidarity to a group who feel under siege.
And I want you to know, and that's why I'm here, that we will do everything we can to keep you safe and stand with Israel.
Are you worried this conflict is driving division here in the UK? What can you do about it?
Well, I've come to this Jewish school this morning specifically to demonstrate my solidarity with the Jewish community here in the UK. I'm determined to ensure that our Jewish community is able to feel safe on our streets.
The scale of this massacre has shocked the world and united Westminster. A minute of silence in the Commons chamber to honour the dead on both sides. 6 Britons have been killed in this war, 10 still missing.
The elderly, men, women, children, babes in arms, murdered, mutilated, burned alive. We should call it by its name. It was a pogrom.
The Labour leadership in lockstep with the government.
Westminster is united. Britain is united with Israel against terror, for international law and the protection of innocent lives. There are difficult days ahead, but our values cannot be compromised. Terror cannot win.
There are senior figures concerned at the retaliation to come.
We can support Israel and grieve with their people, whilst recognising that how a counter-terrorism operation is conducted matters. And it matters because whilst there is an imperative to defeat Hamas in the immediate to secure Israel's future, how they are defeated will shape the region's future.
The fiercest criticism of Israel coming from the left of the Labour Party.
Civilian areas bombed, food, electricity, water, medicines, all cut off. Such collective punishment is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions.
I'm very concerned with the increasing numbers of deaths of innocent Palestinians, the forced mass displacement of Gazans leading to a massive humanitarian crisis.
Will the Prime Minister make it clear to the Israeli government that indiscriminate airstrikes killing civilians is in clear violation of international law?
Language like that has been rare in Westminster in recent days, a relative unity across the benches. Can it hold as this war moves into its next phase?
Well, our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates joins us now. It was the first chance in Parliament for MPs to express the depth of feeling that everyone has been sensing after that war broke out and the acts of terror that we saw. Was there anything that struck you about the debate today?
Well, I was really actually thinking about the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Look, it's a moment like he hasn't really had as Prime Minister in the almost year that he's been in the job. Every single eyeball in the Commons chamber was on him and his response and what he would tell the nation. And there were some concrete things. There was some very sad news about casualties that we know about, some money for humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. But just look at the biggest questions and you know, there were just lots of answers he couldn't give. Now, I saw Rishi Sunak in the morning at a Jewish school in North London. Then he was talking about how Britain was leaning into the diplomatic effort to reopen the Rafah crossing from Gaza into Egypt. By the time he stood up in the afternoon in the Commons, that feels like it has not really gone anywhere. He talked about how he was confident that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, wouldn't seek to escalate this beyond targeting Hamas, but does anybody really know? He talked about not wanting and emphasising the need for there not to be casualties amongst Palestinians beyond Hamas. Who can make any commitments about that? And I was very struck that neither this morning nor in his statement did he want to talk about hostages until a moment in the Commons when Dawn Butler, the Labour MP, said, look, there are relatives of people, Brits, that have been taken hostage in this chamber right now. What do you say? At which point he actually expanded quite unusually about the diplomatic efforts, talking to partners in the region to try and get these hostages freed. I suspect he planned not to do that so as not to give false hope, because he just cannot know what's happening. I just thought of all of that and wondered whether everybody looks for more certainty in a moment like this than a British Prime Minister is really able to give.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Because it's one of those huge moments and everyone is looking to the Prime Minister to find a way of expressing what we can do, but maybe the kind of brutal truth is actually it's something that we're bystanders and we're watching it play out. Thanks very much, Sam, for your analysis there. Sam Coates there. Well, tonight, right now, a protest is taking place outside the BBC's headquarters in central London tonight, and it's over the BBC's reluctance to label Hamas as terrorists in their coverage. Well, Ivor Bennett is there for us. Ivor, what's happening?
Well, there's a few hundred people here, and they're certainly making themselves heard, Sophie, outside BBC headquarters here in central London, chanting things like "Shame on you" out the building behind me in full voice. They gathered here to demonstrate against the BBC and its language, specifically its reluctance to use that word terrorist in describing Hamas. Instead, the broadcaster refers to them as militants or a militant group, in line, they say, with their impartiality rules. But protesters here have told me, well, that in their view, it shows bias and it diminishes Hamas's actions. So they want to see that policy changed. And in the last 10 days or so, the BBC has come in for a lot of criticism for this policy, not just from Jewish groups, but also from politicians. The Prime Minister saying that now is not a time for equivocation. Also, the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, saying that the BBC has lost its moral compass. And you can see probably some of the placards behind me, a lot of them saying, well, if the King can call Hamas terrorists, why can't you, BBC? Well, the BBC would say that's not our policy. Our policy is impartiality, due impartiality. It's been that way for a number of years, and our policy has always been that way. And if they use the word terrorist, they say they would be taking sides in this conflict, and they say their job instead is to report precisely what's happening on the ground, and it's up for the audience, the viewers, the readers, to pass judgment beyond that. Finally, I'll just say it's, and interestingly, that over the weekend there was a pro-Palestinian demonstration outside the BBC here, and the building behind me got covered in red paint. It was splattered by pro-Palestinian activists who said that was because of what, in their view, was biased reporting by the BBC in favour of the Israelis. So you've got the BBC being accused of biased reporting on both sides. So I think the broadcaster might say, look, that probably shows that we're doing our job properly in what is a very divisive issue.
Thank you very much indeed. Ivor there talking from outside that protest at the BBC. We can get a little bit more now from the Director at More in Common, Luke Tryl, and the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Conservative MP Alicia Kearns, here throughout the programme tonight. Thank you both for coming and talking about this. It's, you know, we're just discussing what a, you know, and I'm sure many of you watching will feel the same. It's such a difficult and traumatic story to be reporting on and to be looking at and observing. Alicia, it's interesting, isn't it? Because on the surface, so many different nations and politicians are saying the same thing, that they support Israel's right to defend itself. But what's going on behind the scenes diplomatically?
So behind the scenes, there's an enormous amount of work to do, mainly around aid access and the humanitarian crisis that has been unfolding since the start of last week. Essentially, how do you get that Rafah crossing open? And it looked like we had hope today. It looked like the US and Egypt had struck a deal, but it now looks like, based on reporting I've seen from Sky, that Israel have said actually they won't cease airstrikes on the Rafah crossing. And there are legitimate reasons for concerns. I mean, last week, in a 24-hour period, 3 airstrikes took place against the Rafah crossing. We've already had UN humanitarians killed. We've had journalists killed. We've had so many workers, aid workers killed. It is a legitimate concern for Egypt that they cannot get people in to bring the aid. And actually for us, we don't want our nationals being slaughtered as they're trying to leave. It's incredibly concerning. So that's where the majority of the focus will be. And then longer term, we will move to that discussion about a political settlement. So how do we make sure that Iran doesn't win, that we do see Saudi-Israeli normalisation? That's also where you hear those calls from, you know, for example, me in the chamber today saying we support Israel's right to self-defence, but it has to be within international humanitarian law framework. Because although in the immediate we need to defeat Hamas to secure Israel's long-term safety and security, in the long term, how they conduct this counter-terrorism operation, I don't like calling it a war, how they do this matters because that will determine the long-term safety and security of the region. And actually here in the UK as well, the threat from radicalised individuals.
I was interested to hear you say there how to make sure Iran doesn't win. Can you unpick that slightly? Do you see Iran as behind this?
I do, and look, last Saturday I really sat and struggled. I remember, I mean, we all know where we are when these kind of awful things happen. I was in bed, my child woke me up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I suddenly started seeing all these images over the next few hours. I sat there going, why has Hamas done this? I cannot understand it because it doesn't help the Palestinian people. It actively harms them. It reduces the chance of stability in the region. And the only thing I could think of was that for Iran, it is an existential threat to see Saudi Arabia and Israel normalise relations because they will turn their eye to Iran, the #1 terrorist actor within the region at this time. And that's not something Iran wants to see. Hamas is essentially trying to destroy any concept of peace and a two-state solution.
We were talking a bit about, and Alicia was just mentioning there, about the impact on the UK as well. Because obviously the main thing in everyone's minds is the bloodshed that's happening in the region. But we are seeing some of this hate effectively spilling over into the UK as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, we heard over the weekend from Jewish schools that were advising their students to cover up their uniform. We saw some of the people that took part in that protest over the weekend, a pro-Palestinian protest, but with some people wearing images of paragliders on the back of their coats. So it's clear that there are some elements in British society who want to use this conflict to, you know, pronounce and get support for really vile anti-Semitic views. And it's why I'm so pleased that there's been that cross-party consensus, not just on what's happening in the Middle East, but also here in ensuring that our Jewish communities have the security and support that they deserve in the weeks and months ahead.
It's a difficult balancing act, isn't it, as well? Because obviously, as the conflict carries on, there will be some people who will be looking at what's happening in Gaza, they'll be looking at what is happening to people in Palestine, and they will be thinking, I want to take to the streets, I want to say that I don't agree with this as well. So how do you draw the line?
Well, I mean, there is always been a space for, you know, legitimate protest and expressing your feelings, but, you know, glorifying terrorism, supporting Hamas is against the law, and that is quite clearly one of the lines. You know, pronouncing or expounding anti-Semitism crosses the line, and what we shouldn't pretend actually is that this is something quite complex. Actually, it is very clear there is no place for anti-Semitism, there is no space for glorification of terrorism. Of course, there is space for legitimate protest. And we saw some of those scenes actually with the BBC just now.
It feels, I think one of the things that I struggle with at times is this kind of feeling of it's like helplessness. You just look at what's happening and you feel quite helpless and it's quite difficult to see any way out of it. Is there anything that you think the UK can be doing this year?
So there are a number of things we can be doing. So first of all, we have an important voice in the Middle East. It doesn't matter where I go in the Middle East. They always talk about the UK's aid responsibilities and duties, but actually how welcome we are in the room. So our voice on aid and our voice on making sure that international humanitarian law is upheld our voice matters. I have been urging since July the creation of a special envoy for the Middle East peace process so that the UK can have someone solely focused on how we make sure we get to a two-state solution, how we reduce the tensions in country. Obviously, there is work to be done around the hostages as well. We should be very much talking to our neighbours, as we saw, obviously, with His Majesty the King of Jordan coming to the UK. Those international conversations really matter. But it really is that time for dialogue. But hostages as well, we should be doing everything we can and getting British nationals out, as well as our staff. We have locally employed staff based in Gaza. So there's a whole series of difficult work. None of this is easy. There's no silver bullet. There's nothing easy we should be doing. But actually also being willing to have that complex conversation around this, the nuances, recognising that, yes, we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, we're also seeing a rise in Islamophobia, that, you can raise a Palestinian flag in concern about the international humanitarian crisis. That doesn't mean you necessarily support Hamas, but at the same time, if we see you chasing down, Vahid Beheshti, who's almost put his life on the line trying to get the IRGC prescribed because he has an Israeli flag, you are supporting a terrorist group. And actually, that's another point. The government should be prescribing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps because Iran is Hamas's main backers. They've thanked them publicly for arming them. Let's take action. Let's protect ourselves from them.
It was interesting to hear you say that you don't see this as a war. You see it as a counter-terrorism offensive. Why is that?
Because war suggests that the people of Gaza wanted this. They brought this to Israel's door. This should be a counter-terrorism operation, a bit like Daesh. That was never a war. A war on terror, perhaps. But for me, this should be a very focused counter-terrorism operation, hunting down Hamas cells within Gaza. As I said in the chamber today, we know over 50% of Gazans are under 18. That's children. That's 1.2 million people in Gaza are children in a place the size of the Isle of Wight. The last elections in Palestine and in Gaza were held in 2006. Therefore, the amount of people who chose to have Hamas as their representatives are so small. And the idea that children have any collective responsibility or guilt for the actions of a terrorist group is something I will not countenance. So I think it's really important with this counter-terrorism operation, defeat the terrorists and make sure the civilians have the protections they need so that life in Gaza can come back.
Absolutely right. And thank you so much for both of you for coming on to talk about this. We'll have lots more, of course, about the conflict on the programme today, and of course it is also likely to dominate tomorrow's newspapers once again. We'll have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us then will be the political editors of The Guardian and The Sun. That's Pippa Creer and Harry Cole. Still to come on the Politics Hub, facing a ban from the House of Commons for 6 weeks, the veteran MP Sir Peter Bone is accused of bullying and sexual misconduct.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen? I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch. When people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I've always tried to put people at the heart of the story, like hearing from young women who've been spiked via injections.
I just felt physically sick. That's really in my system.
men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do just because you're homeless.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
Hello, welcome back. Well, as ever, the Politics Hub lives all day in its digital form, so we can have a look at another story making some of the headlines on our digital political hub today. It's been nearly a fortnight since it was announced that the northern leg of HS2 was being scrapped at Conservative Party conference. Well, as speculation mounted in the days and weeks leading up to it, Downing Street kept insisting that no decision had been taken right up until the last minute when it was signed off by Cabinet. Suspicions were raised, we should say, when a video of the Prime Minister speaking about that decision emerged, clearly recorded several days before the announcement. And the video in question is on the Hub right here. And you can also read what Downing Street's explanation was, and you can decide whether you are convinced or not. And you can get all this and much more as well, live video, blogs, updates, the lot, just by scanning the QR code on your screen right now to catch up with the latest on the Hub throughout the day. Now, the Conservative MP, Sir Peter Bone, faces a 6-week suspension for bullying and sexual misconduct. I'm just going to head over to the desk here with Ali Fortescue. A report by Parliament's independent expert panel found that he trapped a member of staff in a room and then exposed himself in what they describe as a deliberate and conscious abuse of power. It also found he repeatedly hit and verbally abused a member of staff. Now, if suspended, it could trigger a recall petition and another by-election for the Conservatives. Peter Bone denies the allegations, saying that they are false and untrue. Ali Fortescue, our political correspondent, has been covering the story for us. Ali, I have to say, when I looked at the details of this, I was like, what? What?
Completely agreed. I mean, I had to read it a couple of times because I was quite taken aback by what I was reading. You mentioned some of it there. I mean, so there's 5 different allegations. 4 of them are bullying, and they include things like what he's called, here you go, this is a report about 50 or so pages long, a humiliating ritual where Mr. Bone would make this staffer, remember this was about 10 years ago, put his hands on his lap when he hadn't done work in the way that Peter Bone wanted it to be done, as you say, repeatedly physically struck and threw things, and that's a direct quote, asked for massages in his office, and then there was one claim of sexual misconduct, and that was when he exposed himself on a trip to Madrid where he insisted that they share a room. So, I mean, pretty disturbing stuff.
He denies it, but it has been upheld.
Yeah, it's been upheld. Well, those 5 claims have been upheld. As you say, denies it. He says they're false and untrue claims. I think there are questions. I mean, a lot of people will know who Peter Bone is. He was obviously very prominent in the Brexit years. He's been an MP for about 20 years. He also was Deputy Leader of the House briefly under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. I think there's questions about this happened 10 years ago. Since then, he was made Deputy Leader of the House. Who knew what, when? And obviously questions, too, about potential by-election in his seat of Wellingborough, 18,000 majority. We've seen bigger majorities overturned by the Conservatives in the last couple of years, so potentially a test for Rishi Sunak.
Ali, thank you very much for the update. Well, Ali was just talking about the by-election element of it. We get some reaction now from Tryl and Alicia Kearns. I'm not going to talk to you about the allegations themselves. He denies them. Ali's just talked us through. But if there was to be a by-election in that seat, I mean, Luke, this is your area, really, could they be on shaky ground, Conservatives?
Well, Wellingborough is one of those seats that was more marginal, but has actually moved quite significantly towards the Conservatives. It's now in that kind of Tamworth, Selby territory. So if the Conservatives if the Labour Party got a swing against the Conservatives that was similar to what they saw in Selby, they would be looking at taking that seat. I actually think we'll get a very good pointer this Thursday in that Tamworth by-election as to whether Labour are able to get that kind of swing in a seat which it's not friendly ground for the Labour Party, and they have been drifting away from Labour. So it's an uphill struggle. But I do just think if you look at the poll leads, if you look at that bounce, which Keir Starmer appears to have had coming out of the conference season, I would imagine the Conservatives will be worried going into that by-election.
It's not a very comforting time to be a Conservative MP with the majority of anything under around 25,000, right?
So I think, look, you know, I've been out on the doorsteps on Friday. I was at Uppingham Market in my constituency just there saying, can I help? On the Thursday, I was in Braunston where I stood by the side of the road with a giant sign that said, come and chat and say, hi, how can I help? And I think what's really awful is that when you hear stories about grim behaviour, appalling allegations that have obviously been upheld today under appeal, it's horrifying. And it's really difficult because you don't want to be tarred with the same brush. And I think the majority of Conservative MPs are out working hard, day in, day out, working on incredibly complex issues to support constituents. And what I've said to mine is I will keep working hard. I have Conservative values that I'm proud of. I hope I've represented you well. I know I fought for you. And I hope that I've made you proud as your representative.
Does it come up quite a lot sometimes, some of the behaviour stuff?
So the behaviour stuff doesn't actually come up as much, but obviously I expect it will in the next few days. You are getting increasing comments about, you know, you versus your party. But the point I make to people is that I stand on a Conservative platform. I'm proud of Conservative values. And it's about how we want to get things done. You know, across the House, there are often differences in the way of achieving things, but people want to achieve things in the same way. But as I say, you know, most MPs, no matter what your colour, you work so hard for your constituency. And I hope that, you know, that's what people will look at when they vote.
But I do think there is a problem with that small number of bad eggs who are tainting the reputation
of the whole... Is that what the polling
shows?
Yeah.
The polling shows it. And in focus groups, I think it's hard for me to think of a time when the reputation of politics has been so low. And it's that perception of one rule for them, one rule for us. I think Partygate, which of course, Alicia, you spoke out against very bravely and powerfully against your own party at times. But that sense of Partygate, they broke the rules. These employment rules they broke. And people say, if I did that kind of thing, it wouldn't take nearly 10 years to get me out. I'd be suspended on day one. And I think that's really dangerous for our politics because it's not a Conservative or a Labour thing. It's this general feeling that our political class live on a different planet. They don't represent us. And as you say, undermines the hard work of the vast majority of MPs. I was lucky enough to work for Nicky Morgan in Loughborough, and I saw how much work she did for her constituents, but that gets blown out of the water by these bad eggs. So I think there does need to be a way of tackling wrongdoing far quicker than what we've seen in this case.
And your point about polling, actually, when you look at the polling, the vast majority of people in this country said they think their local MP is incredibly hardworking and is a good person. But overall, as a kind of employment group, we are scumbags. And if you look at my inbox on a daily basis, I often say, look, the death threats, which, you know, once a month at least, the death threats are hard, but
so once a month you get.
I would say at least, yeah, at least. But actually, although those are very serious, the police activate. For me, often it's that day-to-day email that says you're a scumbag, you don't deserve to breathe, I know you're on the take, you're a dirty, you know, all this kind of stuff. You're an evil person, you're corrupt, you're being bribed, all this kind of polling. That's sometimes harder because you know that, you know, you're making a choice to leave your 2 children at home 3 nights a week to be in Parliament. You know the hours you work and and you won't always get it right. And I will make mistakes, and I have made mistakes. But that level of everyday kind of assumptions that we are corrupt is really hard, but it is something we have to tackle and we have to do better.
Yeah, so you know what, it's actually very powerful when you speak about it like that. I'm sure there'll be like people watching and also MPs as well who will, you know, feel sympathy and your pain on that as well. Thank you both very much for discussion. Still to come on the Politics Hub tonight. The desperate overcrowding in prisons. Could foreign inmates be deported to free up cells? Hello, welcome back. Now, spending money on prisoners isn't exactly a vote winner, especially when the public finances are tight. But the government accepts that something has to be done to address the conditions in our overflowing jails. And if you're not going to spend loads more money, well, the other thing you can do is let more people out of jail. Again, not a vote winner. But today, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, said he would do just that, setting out measures including deporting foreign inmates, sending fewer low-level offenders to jail, and delaying sentencing convicted criminals to help free up places. But of course, criminals not going to jail can have a devastating impact on the victims of crime. Our Home Editor, Jason Farrell, reports.
Juliana lived in fear for months. The man who raped her had drugged her and videoed it.
In the video evidence, he says, I'm completely raping you while you're asleep and unconscious, and making a video of it as well.
Yeah.
So there is no denial of what happened.
So there's a video confession.
Exactly.
Yet still it took 2 years to prosecute him, and in that time he was out on bail.
Given how manipulative and dangerous he was, I was afraid that he would come after me. For at least 8 months, I did not leave my apartment. I didn't have a life. I had to quit my job. I was the one that was in house arrest.
Last week, it was suggested judges would have to delay sentencing of convicted rapists because of the lack of prison spaces.
How bad is it going to be for victims if even after trial, even after conviction, they're still out?
But in the Commons, the Justice Secretary looked to reassure the public.
We will legislate so that rapists, as well as those convicted of equivalent sexual offences, will serve the entirety of the custodial term handed down to them by the courts. A 15-year custodial term will mean 15 years behind bars. Now, there have been inaccurate reports in the media claiming that judges are being told not to send rapists to prison. Let me be categorical. This is untrue.
But the opposition wasn't convinced that some sex offenders won't remain on bail awaiting sentence.
What is the plan to reach out to victims and assure them that the convicted offender in their case will be taken off the streets as quickly as possible? The reason we are in this position, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the government has consistently broken its promises to deal with the rising prison population.
The government reforms to tackle this include turning many 12-month or less custodial sentences into community sentences, some lesser offenders released up to 18 days early, and deporting foreign prisoners sooner. Currently, foreign nationals can be removed up to a year before the end of their sentence. The reform brings that forward to 18 months, which is hoped will save £70,000 per prisoner. But one former judge says that means they get out early, and the cost efficiency may come with a moral price.
Saves the country a bit of money, and you may never know that they've then attacked and killed or raped or whatever someone in their home country, having been released early.
The government says the reforms will reduce crime. The opposition says they should apologise for failing to keep the public safe. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Now, we'll be talking a bit more about that story with the former Justice Secretary, David Gauke, but I just want to bring you a bit of breaking news before we do that, because Belgian media are reporting at least 2 people have been shot dead in central Brussels tonight. It's being reported that both victims were wearing Swedish football shirts. That's ahead of the Euro qualifier match against Belgium this evening in the capital. We'll bring you more on that story when we get it, just the earliest of the reports coming in now. We'll keep across that for you. In the meantime, we can speak now to the former Justice Secretary, David Gauke. Thank you very much for being on the programme. Can you just give us a bit of a sense about what is the situation in our prisons right now?
Well, the current difficulty is that essentially we're running out of spaces, that the prison population is growing pretty quickly, and we have not got spare capacity. And we are within weeks, maybe within days, of essentially no longer having any spaces. And that is the situation that Alex Chalk has been trying to address, an immediate crisis in terms of prison capacity. I think it also has to be acknowledged that the state of our prisons is not good. and that there isn't enough rehabilitation going on within prisons and that it is very stretched. But part of that is the fact that our prison population has grown very quickly. 30 years ago, it was 43,000. Today, it is over 88,000. That is a big increase, and the system has struggled to cope.
I think some of the measures that Alex Chalk has announced are probably more controversial than others. And I'm thinking particularly about the delaying of sentencing of people who have committed some pretty serious crimes, sexual offences, for example. Do you think that's a right move?
Well, I'm not sure that that's a sort of a specific policy that he's wanting to pursue. I think that has been a reaction to the particular circumstances that we're in. And I think, and clearly people are going to be concerned about that. And what is necessary is to try to get our prison system, our criminal justice system, on a sustainable basis where there aren't any artificial delays of this sort. And I think in terms of addressing the immediate pressures, the big policy that Alex Chalk has announced is the fact that certain prisoners are going to be released 18 days earlier than they otherwise would, with certain conditions applying. And then over a longer time period is the move away from short sentences, which is a policy that I tried to pursue 4 and a bit years ago. I think that there's a lot to be said for that, not just in terms of prison numbers, although that will make a contribution, but because the evidence points to the fact that short sentences do nothing to help reducing reoffending, do nothing to help rehabilitation. In fact, they increase the chances of someone committing another offence. And I think that's a sensible step.
So what would your specific policy be on short sentences? Would you say, for example, anyone who has a sentence of under 6 months doesn't go to jail, or would it be more like category specific? So, for example, shoplifting or non-violent offences that you would say you don't have to go to prison?
Well, the approach that I was trying to take in 2019, and I think this is what Alex Chalk is replicating, is that you have to make certain exceptions. I think if there's violence or a sexual offence involved, and I think also if you are in breach of an order of the court or contempt of court, in other words, breaching a court order, you still have to have the flexibility of short sentences there. But other than that, if a crime is not sufficiently serious to be worth sentencing to someone for more than 12 months, you are better off trying to find an effective non-custodial sentence so that they're in the community. Because what happens with a lot of short sentences is that people go inside, they're not there long enough for anything to be organised for rehabilitation or treatment of mental illness or anything of that sort. But if people have got a job, they often lose a job. They can often lose their home. Family links are weakened. Now, these are the factors that actually can help people be rehabilitated. It's a job, it's a home, it's family relationships. And so those short prison sentences are just simply destructive and unhelpful in terms of turning anybody around. And the important thing for society is that you're doing nothing to reduce reoffending. And if we want to reduce crime, we should focus on reducing reoffending. As I say, moving towards community sentences, I think, would be a step in the right direction. That very often happens now, but I think we can go further. And I think Alex Chalk is right to go down this path. OK, well, we'll have to see what happens. David Gauke, thank you very much indeed. David Gauke there, the former Justice Secretary, saying that in his view, there should be a move towards not jailing people for shorter sentences. Still to come on the Politics Hub, we're going to have more from the SNP conference.
Golda was the Prime Minister of Israel in 1973 when the country was surprised by an attack by Syria and Egypt. Like the current situation, it was an absolute shock for the country, but she managed to pull her generals together and led the country eventually to a victory and proved herself to be an absolute rock of intelligence and courage. She was born in what was Russia, now Ukraine.
Kiev, actually, wasn't it?
Kiev, exactly, at the turn of the last century, and grew up with the shadow of the pogroms. Her family, her father, who's a very humble carpenter, decided to move the family to the United States, and one by one he saved up money each year to send each of the children, eventually followed himself. And they settled in Milwaukee, and Golda loved living in America. She loved the freedom. She proved a sort of natural leader. And by the time she was 22, she led a group of Jews back to what was Palestine in 1920 to set about building the new Israel. I think she felt that that's what she needed to do. That was her calling. As I said, she was enormously keen on America and knew the American people well, and was enormously, when in 1948, when once again the War of Independence began, Israel was an impoverished country, and she went to the United States and in 6 weeks raised $50 million by just doing rubber chicken dinners. I have a friend who lives in Los Angeles whose grandfather attended one of these dinners, and Golda persuaded him to remortgage his house. And this was a phenomenal sum of money, and it was enough to equip the army, which eventually managed to see off attacks from every single neighbour.
Hello, welcome back. Now, the SNP conference got underway at the weekend, and the party leader, Humza Yousaf, has rode back on his predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon's pledge to turn the next general election into a de facto referendum. He said it would be ludicrous for his party to open formal independence negotiations if the SNP don't win a majority of seats. So you might think that this marks the SNP moving on from Nicola Sturgeon's legacy. We'll just take a look at the reception she got from the party today.
Hi. Good to see you. Good to see you. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Just lovely to see you smiling.
Well, our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, joins us now. Tamara, it feels quite a long time since we've kind of seen Nicola Sturgeon in that kind of situation. It was a very emotional reception that she got at conference.
Yes, it was a rock star reception, really, for Nicola Sturgeon, who, of course, is still under investigation by the police over the SNP's finances. Some were surprised that she turned up here today as she walked around hugging people, talking to delegates, and then when she went into the hall, she was given a standing ovation organised by the party's deputy leader. Now, of course, this all raises the question about whether she's overshadowing the current First Minister, Humza Yousaf, who's had a difficult first few months in the job. Earlier today, he told journalists that it was to be expected that Nicola Sturgeon was greeted with love and adulation. And when we asked Nicola Sturgeon herself, this is what she had to say about whether she was trying to overshadow her successor.
I've been watching from afar. This is a very different conference experience for me than the ones that I've been used to. But I've been watching from afar over the course of yesterday. I think Humza, you know that, I think Humza's doing a fantastic job as leader of the party and as First Minister, and I don't think there's any doubt from what I've seen about who is in charge at this conference, and it's Humza Yousaf.
So she says she wasn't, but it's significant that Nicola Sturgeon has come here today, not least because the party has just agreed a new position on independence, which I make to be its fourth in the past year. Nicola Sturgeon had wanted the next general election to be, in effect, a referendum on independence. Humza Yousaf has had to row back from that position, not least because the SNP now expect to lose seats at the next election, and say that if they win a majority of the seats in Parliament, Parliament here in Scotland. They will use that as a mandate to look at negotiating with Westminster about the power to hold a referendum. Now, that position is something the party has agreed, so he hopes that that will help him start to move on. But it's been criticised by the SNP's opponents as not only unrealistic, because they might lose seats and still be claiming they have a mandate to negotiate independence, but it also concedes that actually achieving independence, there is no vehicle to do so immediately. It kicks it effectively down the road. So there are some concerns that that might help boost the SNP's opponents, who can say if you vote SNP, you won't get independence anytime soon. Some here at the conference privately say they feel Nicola Sturgeon should not have come. That doesn't help the new First Minister to draw a line under her time in office.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Tamara Cohen there, reporting for us at SNP Conference. Now, it's been quite a heavy programme today, so I just want to end with something slightly different, because if you sit through the average session of PMQs or political debates you might think that politics is all noisy discord, and the actual layout of the Commons, MPs facing off across the green benches, even encourages it, kind of gladiatorial sometimes. So you end up with never kissed a Tory t-shirts and vicious election smear campaigns. But of course, here on the Politics Hub, we're a bit more grown up, honestly. So we thought we'd bring you some of the love-ins across the political divide. Feels like a different age just watching David Cameron and Nick Clegg. Also, I have to just let you into a secret. And when I said in the word, when I just said the words, we are much more grown up in the political hub, someone on me goes, no, we're not, which I actually loved. Right, I feel like I needed that at the end of the show. We can pick up now with Alicia and Luke. It's right, isn't it? Like, Luke, what does the sort of polling show on this? Because it does sometimes feel that like it's all combat, it's all kind of gladiatorial. And that moment at the weekend on the Trevor Phillips programme, when James Cleverly and David Lammy, the kind of two opposing numbers, just had that moment of understanding. I don't know, it just felt quite meaningful almost.
Absolutely, and that's where your average, normal member of the public wants politics to be. If you look at any of the polling, it shows people think that politics is too divisive, that there's too much opposition for opposition's sake, that actually it just feels all a bit exhausting. And the public, look at some of that yaboo you see in PMQs, and OK, some of it's, quite funny theatre if you're into that sort of thing. But most of the time they think, why aren't these people working together to actually get stuff done? And I've been in the lucky or unlucky position of having to go to both political party conferences this year. And let me tell you, the differences between them are nowhere near as great as you might think.
I love your face there at the thought of having to go to more than one party conference. Alicia was just like...
That's a lot of work, but no, I think it's I think it's so important. I often say I really don't like the theatrics, and I think it's really frustrating that too many people come into politics because they hate the opposing party rather than they want to get things done policy-wise, but they disagree with the opposition of how to get things done. Earlier in the week, I took a Labour MP as my date to an event, Dan Carden. I love him to bits. We couldn't be more diverse in our politics. But, he's great to work with. Stuart Malcolm-Macdonald, a fab SNP MP who I absolutely adore. I just think he's absolutely nuts to want to castrate our country and split us up. So independence he and I will not be agreeing on. But I think, there are so many Labour MPs, SNP MPs, Lib Dem MPs who I've worked with on different issues. And you get things done when you work across party. And I would like to take some of the theatrics out because I think it aids and abets those who want to demean politics and who want to bring more division in our society. And we need less of that. We need more dialogue and less division.
Do you think it's getting worse, or do you think it's always been this way?
I do think it's getting worse in some ways because of social media, largely, that there is that sort of impetus and incentive to say the most incendiary things about your opponents because that's what's going to get clipped and end up on social media. And I think actually, if MPs just took a step back and said, OK, this might get me some short-term likes or retweets, but actually it'd be far better for politics as a whole if I did just a bit less of that and a bit more of where can we get on.
And all I can think now is, as our Dan Carden and Stuart Malcolm-Macdonald going to get a load of tweets being like, your friend's the Tory, she likes you. See, it's obvious that you're not really Labour, you're not really, Scott Nat. And that shouldn't be my first thought, but I'm like, oh, God, sorry, guys, if you're watching. I hope I haven't got you in trouble.
Yeah, I think it's all, we get where you're coming from. Yeah. And I think, thank you for a really grown-up debate on all sorts of things today as well. And actually it does feel that with what's happening in the Middle East as well, it puts it in perspective. Like, that's why we had James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary, and David Lammy, his opposite number, having that moment, because, you know, they've been through a really rough week together. Thank you both very much for a lively debate. That is all for tonight on the Politics Hub. Remember, scan the QR code to catch up with all of the latest on the Hub throughout the day. Up next, it is Sarah Jane Mee with the UK Tonight. Good night.